All right, so now that we've seen all the places where we can include CSS in order to change the style of our website, then now is a good time to review the CSS syntax. And you hear this word syntax a lot when you're dealing with programmers or programming, and all that it refers to is just the grammar of the CSS language. Just as in English, we have grammatical rules which state where you should put commas, where you should have full stops, which words need to be capitalized, etc., etc. All programming languages also have their own particular syntax. So let's take a look at what CSS looks like. Now, the first thing that you'll see is the selector, and this comes at the beginning of the CSS rule. And then comes a pair of curly braces, inside which is where your CSS rules are going to reside. And the rule will change the appearance of some property and give it a new value. And each rule has to end with a semicolon at the end. And that is kind of equivalent to the full stops that we see in our English sentences. Essentially, the selector is basically just the who. So who is it that you want to modify in your web page? Is it the H1? Is it the paragraph tags? Is it the image tags? Whose style do you want to change? And the next part is the property. And this is the what. What about that H1 do you want to change? Is it the background color? Is it the text color? Is it its position? And finally, we've got the value, and that is the how. So how do you want to change the background color of the H1? Do you want it to be blue? Do you want it to be red? And that's the value that you're going to give in order to change it. So whenever you get stuck thinking about CSS, this is a good time point in the video to come back to, just to remind yourself what are each of the parts inside the CSS code that you are changing in order to affect the style. So let's look at a real life example. Here I have a website that is dedicated to the true love of my life, which is bacon. And all that I've got in this website is an H1 for the I love bacon heading. And I've got 3 separate paragraphs that just say bacon, 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 which is what I hear in my head most of the time, especially around lunchtime, which it is right now. So, and finally, I've got an image of a piece of bacon. So if I decided to apply some CSS to my website, say, let's change the H1's color to the color red. Now, in this case, the who is, of course, the H1. That's what I'm trying to select, and that's why it's called the selector. And the color, of course, is the what. And finally, the how I'm going to change that color is the value, which in this case, it's red. And by applying the CSS rule, I end up changing the H1's color property to red. Now, let's take a look at that in real life. If you look inside the resources of this lesson, you will find a zip file called Bacon Fansite that you will be able to download. And once you unzip it and extract the files inside, you should find a folder called CSS-Bacon Fansite. Now, inside this folder, there is a HTML file called index.html. And here I've already written a little bit of code in order to create the bare HTML bones of our bacon fan site. Now, I know that some of you guys might be vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian or whatever it may be. If my love of bacon offends you in any way, then I am deeply apologetic, and you can feel free to change or update this website to whatever it is that you worship, like broccoli or spinach, but my thing is bacon, so here we go. So here's the base website, and as the first challenge, I want you to pause this video and create a new folder called CSS, inside which you will create a new file called styles.css, and then you're going to link that file to this current HTML file using an external link. So we're using external CSS. So pause the video and give it a go. All right, that shouldn't have been too hard. If it was, make sure you look at some of the previous videos where we spoke about inline, internal, and external CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside our CSS-Bacon fan site, and I'm going to call it CSS. Inside the CSS folder, I'm going to create a new file called styles.css. And now styles.css is inside a folder called CSS at the same hierarchical level at index.html. So I can go inside the head of this website and I can insert a link that has a relationship of style sheet, and the href is css/styles.css. So now if I hit save, and I can just check to make sure that it's actually been linked up by tapping into the body, changing the background color, which we've done before, and let's just change it to red. Let's go ahead and save everything, hit refresh, and we can verify that it's all linked up and it's all working. Now, I don't really actually want to have a red background for my bacon website. It seems a little bit too fanatical. But instead, we're going to add that CSS rule that we saw earlier on, where we change the text color of the H1 to a red color. So first things first, who am I trying to change? It's of course going to be the H1 in this case. I'm going to open a set of curly brackets, and then I'm going to add the property, or the what. And in this case, it's of course the color property, and I'm going to change its value to red. And of course, remember that the CSS syntax requires that you close off the line with a semicolon. Now, all the parts that we've mentioned in the CSS syntax slides are really, really important. And sometimes you might forget, or you might accidentally remove something, and it will break the code. So let me show you what I mean. For example, if we forgot to put in that, then we can't differentiate between the what and the how, and it'll think that all of this is the what, or the properties we want to change. So that doesn't work. And if you hit save, then the linter inside Atom will actually give you this error saying it expected a colon on line 1, column 12. So you can see your lines and columns down here, and you can see that currently we're on line 1, column 11. So this is line 1, column 12. And this is where it expected a colon. Now, with the colon, if we refresh our website, you can see that it changed our H1 to have a red text color. But without that colon, then you can see that it doesn't affect the style at all. It's not a valid CSS rule. So let's put that colon back in, and let's go ahead and add another rule to modify our H1. Let's change the font size to something really, really huge. Let's say 200 pixels. So let's hit save, let's refresh. You can see we've got this massive title saying, I love bacon. So you can have more than one rule that's applied to the same selector. And very often you'll actually apply many, many rules to the same selector. And you can either have them in line, but as you can imagine, as you get more and more rules, you're going to run out of space pretty quickly. So by convention, most people will write CSS with the selector, the open curly bracket, then each CSS rule will go onto a new line. And this way you can clearly see and make sure that each line ends with a semicolon and each of the properties are separated from the values by a colon. Now, there's another sort of best practice is that once you start getting a lot of these rules, say, 20 all in one paragraph, then it starts getting hard finding them. So usually the best practice is to keep all of these rules in alphabetical order. And in fact, if you put font size before color and you hit save, Atom will actually give you a warning telling you that the linter advises that the best practice is have all of your properties in alphabetical order. That way, when you come to debugging or trying to figure out what's going wrong, then it'll be much, much easier to find each and every property that you're looking for. Now, as you might have seen, it's quite easy to find the who because we're just looking at the HTML element, for example, the h1 tag, and we're simply ignoring the angle brackets of the tag, and we're just picking up on the name of the HTML element to use as our selector. Now, as a challenge, I want you to change the background of this bacon image to red as well. So take a look at the index.html and implement your CSS code inside styles.css. So pause the video and give that a go. All right, so how did that go? Now, of course, the easy part is the who in this case, which is the image tag. And we're not including any of the other attributes like source or alt text, etc. We're just interested in that red part, which is the name of the HTML element. So we're going to go into our styles.css and we're going to target our selector, which is, of course, the image tag. Then we're going to open a set of curly braces, and inside we're going to define our rule. And the property that I wanted you to change for the image was its background color, and we wanted to change it to red as well. So let's hit save and let's hit refresh, and you can see we've now got a bacon image that has a red background. Now, at this point, it seems easy to see how to find the who, right? The image or the p tag or the h1, whatever it is that you want to change, you simply use it as the selector inside your CSS code. Now, what about the what or the properties? How do we know what keywords we can and can't use and what they will affect? Well, you guessed it. This is where we go back to the web docs. So if you have a look on the MDN homepage and you go to technologies and you go to CSS and then you go to their CSS reference, you can see that it talks about the syntax, but more importantly, it has this entire directory of keywords, which are effectively our properties. So these are the whats that we can change. And you'll find everything that we've used so far, for example, background color or font size or whatever it is that you're looking for. And these are all of the generic properties that you can change using CSS rules. And if you click on each of them, then it'll take you to a more detailed page where it shows you how you can implement the code and what different types of code will do for your styling. So have a play around with all of these different properties and see what other things you can do to make this bacon fan site look more the way that you want it to. And once you're done, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at the simplest type of CSS selectors, and that is selecting based on the HTML tags. Now, in this lesson, I want to show you the other things that you can use as selectors in order to make more specific changes to your website. So, for example, we have this image of a piece of bacon. Now, what if I wanted to have another image that was a broccoli, and I want to show people how much I dislike broccoli? Then I could go to Emojipedia and I could search for broccoli, and I found my broccoli. And this is a really cool website because it lists all of the emoji graphics from different operating systems. So this is Apple's version of a broccoli emoji, and this is Google's, this is Microsoft. Not sure that this looks more like a tree than a broccoli. But feel free to go through this list and see what emoji you prefer. I quite like this one. I think it's most realistic. And then just go ahead and right click and copy the image address. And we're going to use that as the source of our image. And you can see up here, this is exactly the same way how I got the image for our bacon. And I'm just going to add an exactly and just go ahead and right click and copy the image address. And we're going to use that as the source of our image. And you can see up here, this is exactly the same way how I got the image for our bacon. And I'm just going to add an alt text just in case the image doesn't display. And I'm going to say this is the broccoli dash image. So now if I hit save and I go to my bacon fan site, you can see that my broccoli now shows up. But the curious thing is that my broccoli also has a red background, even though I just put it on screen. I didn't even have time to look at the styles yet. So why is that? Well, if we take a look inside style.css, you can see that by targeting the image tag, we're applying this red background color to every single image inside our website. And that might be what you want, but in most cases, that's not really specific enough. And in my case, what I'd like to do is that I want to have the bacon to have a green background color to say, eat more bacon, and the broccoli to have a red background color to say, broccoli is evil. So how can I achieve that? Well, I can't do that just by using tag selectors. So I have to go a little bit more advanced in my CSS, and I have to use class selectors. So if you head into your index.html, and after the image tag, we're going to add another attribute. So remember, HTML attributes are things like the source or the alt tag, etc. And the one that we want to add now is the class attribute. Now, the class attribute allows us to differentiate all of our different HTML elements. So for example, for this bacon image, I'm going to give the class a name of bacon. And for the broccoli image, I'm going to name this class broccoli. So now what I can do is, instead of coloring all the images red, so I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. So in CSS, commenting is a little bit different from HTML in the sense that we have to use a /, a asterisk, and then to end the block of comments, we use another asterisk and a /. So everything in between the asterisks will be commented out and won't be considered as code. So let's give our CSS file some sections. Shall we? Let's say that the top section are our tag selectors, and the next section are our class selectors. So inside this section, I'm going to tap into that bacon class. in order to only change the styling for the bacon image and give it a background color of green. So to target a class rather than a tag, the only difference is a full stop or a dot in front of the class. So my class is called bacon. So to use it as a selector, I just say dot bacon, and the rest of the CSS rule looks exactly the same. And I'm going to say that for the bacon class, I want their background color to be green. But for the broccoli class, now make sure you don't have any typos. So to use it as a selector, so to target a class rather than a tag, the only difference is a full stop or a dot in front of the class. So my class is called bacon. So to use it as a selector, I just say dot bacon, and the rest of the CSS rule looks exactly the same. And I'm going to say that for the bacon class, I want their background color to be green. But for the broccoli class, now make sure you don't have any typos, because if you misspell the selector, the property, or the value, you might not get what you expect. For example, what I've done here, because they all need to be spelled exactly the same way as you spelled it inside your HTML code when you gave the class a name. So for our broccoli image, we want the background color to be red. So now if we hit save, then what's going to happen is that different styles will be applied to our two images. So even though they're both image HTML elements, because this one has a class of bacon, it's going to have a background color of green, as we specified. And because this one has a class of broccoli, it's going to have a background color of red. So let's just quickly verify. And there we go. We've got our bacon that's colored in green, telling you how healthy it is. And we've got our broccoli colored in red, telling you how it's probably not edible. So for things like paragraph, probably not edible. So for things like paragraph elements or image elements or anchor tags, then it's very, very rare that you'll want to style them exactly the same way. So by using the class as the selector, you can better differentiate and make more specific styling choices for your website elements. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can use class selectors instead of tag selectors. And this gave us way more flexibility and allowed us to specify the styles that we wanted for individual image tags or individual HTML elements. Now, if you're looking at CSS selectors, you might also come across the ID selector. And the ID selector is a little bit different from the class selector, although they do have some similarities. So let's try an example. Inside this H1, I'm going to add an ID attribute, and this is going to have an ID called heading. Now, in order to change the style of my heading and target the heading ID, I have to start the ID selector. And the ID selector is a little bit different from the class selector, although they do have some similarities. So let's try an example. Inside this H1, I'm going to add an ID attribute, and this is going to have an ID called heading. Now, in order to change the style of my heading and target the heading ID, I have to specify my selector slightly differently. So let's create a new section down here called ID selectors, and I'll show you how you can select it. So remember, our ID is called heading, and in order to target it, I need to use the hash symbol, or some might call it the pound sign. And then I'm going to add the name of that ID, which was called heading. And the rest of it is exactly the same. So let's make the color of the heading blue, shall we? And let's hit save and refresh. And you can see that even though we've got the H1 still specified as having a red text color, because our ID and our class selectors are more specific, this style will override this one. And if you have a look inside the Chrome Developer Tools, selecting the H1, you can see that we've got the H1 color being red, but it's crossed out because the ID heading is more specific, and therefore this is the one that we see on our website. Now, this is the same for our class selectors. For example, let's get rid of these comments to put this back online. And we can see that we're saying that all images should have a background color of red, but the bacon class should have a background color of green. And if I hit save and I refresh, absolutely nothing changes. And that's because if we have a look inside the Chrome Developer Tools and we select our bacon image, then you can see that the image tag selector is specifying that the background color should be red, but our bacon class overrides that because it's more specific, and this is saying that it should be green, and that is what we see on screen. So that is one similarity between classes and IDs. Now, people get very, very confused about when should you use IDs, when should you use classes, because they seem like they're kind of similar, right? Well, one of the big differences between the two is that you can only have a single instance of one particular ID name inside a single page. So I can't, for example, go into the paragraph tag and say that this one's ID is also called heading. And you'll see that Atom gives me this error saying that heading must be unique. I can only use this ID in one place. But whereas with class, it doesn't really matter. I can say that this class is bacon. I can say this class is bacon. Everybody's class is bacon. Doesn't matter at all. So you would use the ID to identify elements where there is only a single one of them on a particular page. For example, there's probably just going to be one heading. Or if you had a navigation bar, you're probably only going to have one navigation bar on your website. But for the class, you can use it to group related elements that are all going to behave or have a similar style. For instance, if you had a blog and you wanted to style all the comments on the blog pages, then they're probably going to look exactly the same as each other. So they might all have the same class value. So use classes when you want to apply the same style to a group of related items, and use the ID to apply a specific style to a single element on your web page. And some say the analogy is kind of like name versus passport, where anybody can have the same name, right? There's many, many Angelas, I'm sure, across the world, but there's only one person with my particular passport number, and that uniquely identifies me across all of the other humans in the world. So the similarities are they're both used to identify HTML elements that you want to style, and CSS doesn't actually care what you use. If I said ID equals heading here or class equals heading and applied the style, it doesn't actually matter. CSS doesn't care. The other similarity between IDs and classes, as we mentioned before, is that they are more specific than the tag selectors, and any of these styles will override any tag selector styles that are applied to the same element. The other thing that you'll notice is that some of these tags have predefined CSS styles that are applied by the browser. So for example, the H1 If we have a look inside our Chrome Developer Tools and I select the H1, then you can see that these user agent style sheets, this comes from the browser, and this is applied no matter what CSS style you put down. But if you do specify something using a tag selector inside your CSS file, for example, here for the H1, I said that the font size should be 200 pixels, and that overrides the default size for the browser, and it can be further overridden using IDs or classes. Now, the differences between IDs and classes, which is what trips up most people, and the first thing to remember is that a particular ID can only be used once on this page. So I can only have this heading ID once on this page, but I can have more than one ID. So I can say maybe this one's ID is called first paragraph, but I cannot use this again anywhere else inside the same page. The other difference is that any HTML element can have more than one class, but it can only have one ID. So what does this mean? Well, let's say that I wanted my broccoli image to be circular, then we can change the border radius as we did previously. And I can do that by adding another class to my broccoli image called circular. And if I go into my style sheet and I target this class to my broccoli image called circular. And if I go into my style sheet and I target this circular class, then I can specify that its border radius should be 100%, which is going to be circular. So now that circular border radius is going to be applied to this image alongside the styles for the broccoli class. So if we hit save and refresh, you'll see that my broccoli image is now circular, but my bacon image is left completely alone. And I've implemented this by adding two classes to the same HTML element. Now, you can't do the same thing with ID. So let's add another ID, for example, called big. And we tried putting it down here. And let's use it to change the font size to something ridiculous like 1000 pixels. Let's hit save and refresh. You can see that all the styles for that heading ID are now removed because this is not a valid ID. You can't have more than one ID for a particular element. So that is another difference between classes and IDs. Now, in practice, and when you look at CSS code in the wild, you'll see people use classes absolutely everywhere. You'll see tag selectors being used broadly to affect the appearance of HTML elements, but you'll see IDs used more sparingly. And in fact, the linter for CSS on Atom actually suggests against using IDs as a selector to change the style. Now, I don't entirely agree with that because I think there are cases where it can be useful, but you do have to think very carefully when you do decide to use it. Now, the last thing I want to show you with regards to CSS selectors is something called a pseudo class. And if we have a look inside the CSS reference, amongst all of the different properties and their keywords, you can see that some of these have a little colon in front of them. And these are pseudo classes. And this is because HTML elements can have different states. So for example, when I hover over a piece of text or an image, that's actually a different state over and have different pseudo classes. Colon in front of them. And these are pseudo classes. And this is because HTML elements can have different states. So for example, when I hover over a piece of text or an image, that's actually a different state. And I can get the CSS to change based on the state, i.e. hovering over or not hovering over, by using these pseudo classes that have a colon in front. And the one that you'll see the most often is the hover pseudo class. And this is what it looks like. So you can select the hovered state of any HTML element in order to affect its style. So let's go ahead and do that for our image tag. Let's say that when our HTML image elements are hovered over, or you might know it as rollover or mouse over. But when our images are in this particular state, let's say that the background color should be maybe a gold color. Let's hit save and let's refresh our site and let's check it out. So if I go ahead and hover over my images, you can see that it changes the background color to this gold color, simply by using that pseudo class of hover. So take a look at some of these properties and different ways of using selectors and use it to mess around with your website to personalize it even more. Well done for completing the last module. It wasn't easy, but you got it done. Now, I want to take this opportunity to share with you some of the things that I've learned that I wish somebody had told me while I was learning programming and learning other things as well, in fact. And one of those things is the ability to get rid of distractions. Because let's face it, my phone probably has a million notifications. The other day, I almost fell down the stairs because a notification came on the Apple Watch and I was looking at it while I was going down the stairs and I actually missed a step. And these little moments of distraction, even though they seem like it's very quick to take a look at your phone, see what it's trying to tell you, and then get back to what you're doing, you won't believe how long it actually takes for you to get back into the same level of focus as you had before. In fact, some scientists actually did a study on this, and they showed that for a distraction that is as short as 1 minute, let's say somebody asking you, hey, do you want a cup of tea? I'll make you one. And you say, yeah, sure. And then you get back to your work. For some people, it can take up to 25 minutes to be able to get back to the level of focus that they had before. So a really, really useful thing is when I start working, I put my phone into airplane mode and I put it into a drawer because every time I see it, I want to touch it. It's like some sort of weird spell it's got on me. So I put it away and it doesn't bother me, it doesn't make noises. And maybe other people will have emergencies, but there's always other ways that people can reach you. So get rid of your distractions. It might not be the phone. It might be you need to shut yourself in a room so that other people don't distract you. Or it might be that you need to find a quiet time when you can actually do this, like early in the morning or late in the evening. But see how you can remove those distractions and see your level of focus go up and see how much more you're able to do. So I hope that was helpful, and I've got plenty more of these for you coming along the way. So keep going.